Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development CropTalk webinar. If you have any questions today, you can answer them or put them in the question section of the GoToWebinar menu, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. Lionel is having some technical difficulties today, but Dennis Lang has stepped in and will take over with his presentation. So go ahead, Dennis, take it away.
Good morning, all. Welcome to Successful Pea Production. Was asked to do this. This is kind of a timely topic. I'm going to go through some of the things that I feel that are important in having a good, successful pea crop in 2021 and future years. So starting off, let's take a look back. And what's really interesting here for I'm just going to go here to pointer options and go here. So for 2020, we actually broke a record again for pea yields in Manitoba. We were looking at 57, just over 57 bushels an acre. We had 143,000 and change in harvested acres, and that is a record for Manitoba. We've had another good year for peas in Manitoba, and expecting an increase in acres moving forward. This is kind of the 5-year snapshot of where pea acres have been, going back to 16. 16 was one of our big years, but 16 was also one of our wet years, so the yields were much lower that year. Since then, we've had some drier summers, and peas seem to like those kind of growing conditions. We've seen some pretty good yields across the province, with our lows of just under 50 and our highs at 57. When we look at the 10-year average, we're looking at 40 bushel per acre for peas in Manitoba. When we look at the 5-year average, that's much better at 50 bushels an acre. So some pretty positive takeaways on that. And 2020 projected, I'm throwing out a number at 200,000 acres for this upcoming year. We've seen some strong prices, we've seen good yields, and growers definitely see the benefits of growing peas in the rotation. So why do farmers grow peas in rotation? Well, typically some of the reasons: number one, it's early planting, typically late April, early May. Peas are very frost tolerant, so they can come back if you do get a slight frost in spring. Early harvest, it does help to spread out the workload because you're harvesting in mid-August versus the cereals and canola, which is a bit later. Peas are a legume crop. That means no supplemental nitrogen, and they're really good at fixing nitrogen as well. So that's an added benefit for growing peas. And pea stubble typically provides a very mellow soil for the following year, and then a lot of growers have commented how much they enjoy seeding into that pea stubble the following year. So let's start off with yields, and in particular, let's start off with variety trials, and we're going to go into Seed Manitoba here 2021. I'm going to show you a couple things there. Starting off here, just want to mention that on the online version of Seed Manitoba, under the web exclusive section, we've been posting the protein contents of the peas from the trials this past year. We have our 5 sites listed here. We have the average pea protein and a breakdown by site as well. Keep in mind, this is on a dry matter basis. If you're getting a pea protein content done at your local elevator, that's going to be done at a 13% moisture basis, which will be lower in that 3% to 4% lower. That's being reported at the elevator, but on the dry matter basis, this is the kind of numbers that we're running. So we've seen some good numbers. They range from anywhere from just over 23 to a high of 26 on the yellow side for the average, and some good numbers there. And we've gone back a few years. We go all the way back to 2017. So if that's of interest to you, you can kind of check that out on the web exclusive section of the Seed Manitoba website. But getting into the guide itself, there's 2 tables in the guide. The first one is the variety description table. And in the variety description table, we have long-term yields and the number of site years that each of the varieties are tested. We have things like seed size, and that's going to be relative seed size, and that's based on the registration data. We have some lodging scores, we have powdery mildew ratings as well. And something new this year, and we've always had maturity in there, but it was always rated on, we've always used the scale that they use for the co-op registration trials. But this year, what we've actually done is we've actually done our own maturity ratings within Manitoba. So you can see here, we use as a check, we use Amarillo, which is about 94 days, and 94 days would be considered long maturing. So anything that is 0 to 3 days longer than a check is considered long maturing, Anything that is 3 days earlier and earlier than the check are considered early. So when you look down this list here, you can see here the mixture of maturities within the within the list here. So there are some really early ones that are much earlier than check, and there's some that are equal or maybe just slightly earlier. And one thing I mentioned, if you go back a slide here, I'm just going to go back here one slide. You'll notice here that powdery mildew resistance. We have a column here for that. There is one thing we'll change for next year. The spectrum is actually rated as very good. It's with powdery mildew. All varieties registered in Canada now have to be powdery mildew resistant. So it should be either a yes or no, but we're going to change that for next year. There is one variety though of green peas though that is susceptible to powdery mildew. And to show you what powdery mildew looks like, this is from a trial from a number of years ago. This was a variety that was not powdery mildew resistant. It was quite a devastating disease back in the day. And you can see here how it set into the crop and how it compares to the variety that is powdery mildew resistant. So that's the reason why we have these varieties now that are resistant, so that we don't have to deal with that disease anymore. Now, when you're looking at the second table, which is the yield table, this one I've done a few times as far as explanation, but I'm going to do it again here today. And I'm just going to hide my pointer option here, get rid of that here. And what I'm going to do here is, the first thing you do when you look at these tables and you're trying to determine whether or not there's differences in the varieties, the first thing you need to look for is the LSD, and in this case, it's a percentage. The LSD stands for least significant difference. And what that means is that any varieties, in order to be considered statistically different in yield, have to differ by either that amount or greater or less. So for example, the LSD in carberry is 17, and Hamiota it's 7, and Melita it's 11. And these are all determined statistically. And they are sort of related to the CV, which is the number above it. The CV, or coefficient of variance, tells you how much variation there is in the plot. And the lower the number, the more confident you are in the data. Typically, we don't publish anything that is over 15% CV, but what you'll see that if you have a CV that is a little higher, then your LSD is also a little higher as well. That kind of incorporates a wider area, whereas where your CV is lower, that number tightens up. So we highlighted the LSD here. Next, we want to highlight a check variety. So we're going to use Amarillo because that's our check. You can actually use any check that you want as long as and still use these numbers for the direct comparison. But to make life easy, we use Amarillo to check at 100%. So then what I do is I highlight anything that is 17% and greater in yield than the check. So when I do that, I get all these values here. And at each site, you can see here that sometimes only 1 or 2 varieties, and sometimes there's 3 or 4. This does vary from year to year, and the reason this is important, now it'll come together in the end. The one thing I noticed when I was looking over this, there's one that's actually not highlighted here, and I'm just going to hit enter once more. That one is actually higher yielding than the check as well, because it's 118%, because it's greater than that 17. If you do the same thing with varieties that are less than the check, there you see a few other ones that are statistically lower than the check. And what I like about this is when you look across the columns, then you can see how each variety performs under different growing conditions. So in some cases, maybe you want to look at varieties that really perform well at multiple sites. Anything that's not highlighted, that means that variety is the same yield as the check, and that's what you're looking for. Anything equal to or higher yielding than the check is what you're really looking for yield, because we typically try to choose a strong check. And if varieties are equal to the task, then you know you got a good variety when you're picking new lines. So I'm going to review a couple of things that happened this past year. Swan River had some major wind issues in 2020. As you can see here by these pea seedlings, they've gotten beaten up, and in some cases these fields have gotten beaten up a couple 3 times in spring, and growers are wondering what would happen. Because of their growth structure, they have what they call scale buds and or scale nodes, depending on how you want to refer to it. But scale nodes typically are either just at the soil surface or below. So if the upper portion of the plants gets damaged, they do tend to come back. So this is what the grower sent me a picture of in spring, and I said, you know what, just, you know, the field looks clean, leave it be, let it grow. And then he called me in July, and that's what that field looked like in July. So the peas definitely did come back. Not all crops do that. Peas are one of those crops, though, that are it's pretty phenomenal how they can come back. Another example of this is back in 2018, we had some field pea trials out in Boissevain, Manitoba, and they had a really nasty hailstorm that went through that pretty much flattened a lot of the crop in that area. We had soybeans and dry beans and peas at this site, and upon inspection, we determined that the peas looked like they could still come back. There was still some material there, and we know that they have those scale nodes, so we know they're going to come back. The soybeans and the dry beans, yeah, there was nothing there to leave anymore. They really got stripped down. But when we go into the growing season, you can see here, this is still from that June 14th hailstorm. Peas are really beaten up. But then we go just over a month later, and you see how things kind of grew back. And they're just mowing between the plots here, but you can see here they've really come back. August 2nd, things are starting to mature. You know, August 7th, getting close to harvest. And when it was all said and done, the Boissevain site actually had good data. We had a CV of 5.9, which is good, nice and low, LSD at 11, and a yield of 48 bushels per acre on our check. It was lower yielding than the other sites that we did have, but still definitely some good data. And as far as the harvest date, you can see here, really wasn't that much later than the majority of the plots here. So at the other site, so still came back pretty good. Crop rotation is another thing that growers always ask about. Okay, what are some of the better crops to rotate peas with? This is some data from MASC, and this is based on growers' harvest production reports, where they looked at yield responses from 2000 to 2012. And the way to use this table is you look at the top for crop planted, you look for field peas, and then here's your field pea column, and this is a yield index. So anything, you know, close to 100 or better is considered, you know, a good thing. So when you're looking at spring wheat, that showed 103% yield response. So that means that's a good crop to rotate peas with. You can see here some of the other crops. Flax definitely does not look like a good option. And then there's some crops here that don't really fall into that rotation. And again, this number here is just the frequency of how often that happens. So you can see here that 56% of the time that's what the rotation is with peas and spring wheat. So going back to a shorter time frame from 2008 to 2012, we see a similar trend. Winter wheat, spring wheat, and barley looks really good as far as which crops you can rotate on. So again, something you really want to kind of look at when you're looking at that. And the frequency here, still spring wheat's the most common. So at the end of the day, you know, the cereals seem to be the most common. Canola, in this case here, canola is looking about 92%, and oats is about 97%. So you can see here which fields peas do the best on. Okay. This is from another article from Crop Insurance based on kind of the same analysis of data. What they've done here is they've looked at the rotational break between peas and other crops, or between peas and peas, I guess. So what I'm looking at here is 71% or 72% of the time, you see that there is 4 years or more of the growers that are planting that kind of rotation. Where here you're looking at 3 years, it's only about 21% here. So you can see here that growers realize that peas do have some disease challenges, and having that longer rotation is more beneficial. And the yield here as well kind of falls into that, and that 3 to 4 years seem to have the greatest yield bump when you do that. So that's all tied together in those two articles. So what are the future of peas in Manitoba? A couple of questions you need to ask yourself. What are some of the best management practices, and how can you make that happen? And what problems can stand in the way? So as far as what best management practices you need to look at, things like a good launch, what makes a good launch, getting your peas off to the right start, and things you need to keep in mind to get right by mid-June. And what problems can stand in the way? You know, what are some of the threats to success, and things that growers really need to be watchful about. Okay. Well, one of the first things for a good launch is a good plant stand. You can see here the image on the right is in that 7 to 8 plants per square foot range. So good, nice, even stand. It'll help with weed control. This image on the left here, you're looking at a much thinner stand. You're going to have more challenges with the plants, in some cases, flopping over. You're going to have challenges with weed control. So that's one of the first steps you need to have, is have a good plant stand. Okay. So what is that? How do you go about getting a good plant stand? Well, ideally, you want to end up with a stand between 7 to 8 plants per square foot, which means you're planting at a higher rate than that, because you do have germination. You never have 100% of the seeds germinate. You may have higher mortality because of dry seed. So you may be planting 9 or 10 plants per square foot, or seeds per square foot, but you're ending up with 7 to 8. You can still get good yields with 5 to 6 plants per square foot, but you do have to keep on top of the weed control, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. With low populations, as I mentioned earlier, you can have poor weed control and poor standability, because those plants don't have that ability to interlock. That's the idea behind the semi-leafless varieties, is that if you have a good plant stand, you should be able to shake the stand and really see it shake all the way into the crop canopy if you got a nice even stand. One of the probably the most beneficial things you can do as a producer is figure out what kind of stand you have about a month after planting. Growers tend to spend a lot of money on equipment, and that's great, trying to get the best equipment to plant and get the most even stand. But in some cases, what happens is you plant it and then you kind of forget about it. So what I would suggest is get yourself a hula hoop. I like to, when I buy my hula hoops, I go to the local convenience store where they have these things, bargain stores, those types of things. Take a tape measure inside and measure something to get close to 28¼ inches. Because if you're using that, the multiplication factor is 10,000. So it makes it really easy to try to do plant stand counts. Again, so if you're looking at to determine if you're at that 7 to 8 plants per square foot, you should have at least 30 to 31 plants in that hula hoop. And you can see here, if you're less than that, that's when you start getting into that 4 and 3 plants per square foot. But I think it's just a really useful tool. You're probably driving across your field with your quad anyways. Take that hula hoop, drop it down a few times, do a few quick stand counts. And the importance of that is just to make sure that, to try to figure out if there's a problem, for one, with either the seed, or in some cases, maybe the equipment was causing some problems. Maybe you had dry seed and you didn't get the emergence that you want. So you need to address some of those things for future years. A good launch also means the right seeding time. This is some data from MASC, and you can see the link here where I took that from. The red line here is for field peas, and along the bottom here, this is week and month in the month of May. So they start here, the first week of May here has the highest yield potential. And as you go into May, into that 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th week of May, the yield potential drops. Part of the reason for that is the later you plant peas, the more susceptible they are to heat blasting in the hotter temperatures of July. So you can lose some of those flowers and reduce your yield. So that's why we always recommend, getting in late April, early first part of May, and to maximize your yield potential. And again, just the statement I just made earlier. So good launch, good location. This is neither one of those. This is a field up in the Beausejour area that the grower put into peas, and lo and behold, we got a lot of rain during the summer, and it did not make for a good result. That heavy clay soil with poor drainage, too much summer rainfall, definitely not a good launch. And I threw this one in here. It's kind of interesting because this is the same pea variety, 2 miles apart, different soil types, same amount of moisture, but the image along the bottom here on the right here, that field was much lower, heavier clay content, not as well drained, where the picture on the left here where my summer student was standing, that field did over 80 bushels. So you can see here, just because you can grow peas on one field doesn't mean you can grow it on every field. You have to be selective on where you put it, and this point is illustrated by these photos. High quality seed, really important. Knowing, the germination of the seed, and knowing also too what the seed moisture is like. You can see here there's a few cracks and 2 splits in here. And I like to do if I do have a dry seed lot, I like to do something called a soak test, where I take 100 seeds and throw it in a container of water, and just to let them soak and swirl them around gently. And then what you're going to do is, as the seed coat separates, you pull those out and you do your counts. If you're under 10% cracks, you're fine. No, it wouldn't have to do any readjustment. Once you start approaching 15 and 20%, then I would suggest bumping your seeding rate. That way you can compensate for some of those dry seeds. Those dry seeds typically can get banged up even more so when they go through the distribution system of the air seeder. So it's just something you really need to keep in mind. So germination is only part of the story. Cracked seed coats is something you need to pay attention to as well. Okay. Other seeding considerations, I've been hearing some reports this year that we've had some very large seed size this year. So if you're in that really large seed size, your seeding rate's definitely going to go up as well, because you need to, in order to get that the population that you're shooting for. So keep those things in mind when you're doing your calculation, that there are differences. If you're at 240, you have a different seeding rate than if you're at a 280, and if you're over 300, well, then you're 300 to 350, which I've heard some reports of this year. Then you're going to be looking at, that conversion works out to close to 4 bushels an acre. So keep those things in mind. I know it's expensive. It's going to be an expensive year for seeding, but you also want to make sure that you get the right stand. Nothing worse than having a thin stand, because you're dealing with that for the entire summer. Okay. A good launch also means good nodulation as well. Knowing what your field history is of peas will help you determine what form of inoculant you'd like to use. If it's a new field to peas, or a very low history of peas, meaning that maybe you've only had peas once in the last 10 years, what I would recommend is either a liquid peat on seed and a granular as a sideband, because that's considered to be double inoculation. Not the liquid peat together is not double, it's just a double rate. Whereas liquid and granular separately is another way of addressing, the spreading risk a little bit more, so that if there is some issues with the on-seed inoculant, you have that backup as a granular. And it's really important to do that in the early with no history of peas on your field. The seed treatment issue is another question that came up as well. Seed treatments can have an effect on inoculants. So if you are using seed treatment, that might be one instance where you might want to go liquid and granular together as well, just in case there's some antagonism with the seed treatments. In the Guide to Crop Protection on page 546, there is a listing of the fungicide seed treatments and the insecticide seed treatments that you can use. I put some of the fungicide seed treatments here: Ensure Pulse, Tralex Evergold, Vibrance Max, Vitafold Brands, Rancona, Integral, Solo. The ones with the A behind it gives you some control of early season Aphanomyces, only on the seed, but not in season. I want to make that clear. The other ones are more for Fusarium and Rhizoctonia. My thought this year is the soil temperature is still pretty cool in late April. I would recommend using a seed treatment. A fungicide seed treatment would be my first choice. If you do have insect problems, there are some insecticides you can add to it as well. A lot of the seed dealers have different preferences on which ones they use. To me, I think it's just more important to have some type of seed treatment there, especially going into that cold soil. So talk to your local dealer to see what they have available to you. But I had a conversation with a few people yesterday about the use of fungicide seed treatments in Manitoba on field peas. And we're probably somewhere in that 55 to 60% that do get used as a fungicide seed treatment. So I think it's a really good thing to do on these years when we have cool soil. This is a question that came up here when we been reviewing some of the latest information. This has to do with field pea staging. And one of the things I'm going to talk about here, we've always talked about node stages in peas and how, between the first and the sixth node is kind of the ideal time for spraying. But there's a little bit of confusion in there. I'm going to try to clear that up a little bit. Peas have 2 scale nodes, and they can be below the surface or just slightly above, and that's where that regrowth happened, as we talked about earlier. But for insecticide or for herbicide timing, we want to look at the leaf stage. So wherever there's this big elephant ear leaves clasping the main stem, that is where I would count the leaf stage. So when a chemical recommendation is called from 1 to 6 leaf stage, or in some cases they might call for 1 to 6 node stage, ignore the scale buds and just count these ones, and then you'll be fine. So in this one here, and the ones we count are the ones that are open. So here we have 1, and this one's just starting to open. Here we have 1, 2, and that one's fully open as well. So you always want to count those big banana leaves that are open, and then you'll be fine. Okay, good launch equals early weed control, really important. This is a slide here where it talks about the time of weed removal, the weeks after crop emergence. If you can get those weeds out early, you get your maximum grain yield, but the longer you leave those weeds, the lower your yield potential will be. Again, we talked about that 1 to 6 leaf stage. Keep in mind that those peas can move very quickly. So you may not even have a very tall plant, and you could be at that 4th or 5th leaf stage already. So you really need to be on top of that and scouting early to make sure you're on the correct timing for that. This is from the Guide to Crop Protection, page 70. These are weeds that are controlled in peas before or after seeding, but before emergence. You can see here we do have a few different options that growers can use. I think the way to look at weed control in peas is controlling weeds before the crop is planted, and then controlling weeds after the crop is planted. So here are some of the options here that you can use. I'm not going to go through each one here, but you can see here which weed control products you can use. So there are definitely some good options in there. Going to the next slide here. This is just the weed control slide here that talks about the different chemistries. So you have, you still have the edges and the authorities and the things like Volterra, Triturulin, Post, Odyssey, all those products. Pay attention though to make sure you're at the correct staging, and keep in mind that leaf staging we just talked about. Some of the future threats to success. I guess microspirilla blight is always a concern, and I'll talk about that in a moment here, how to address that. I'm not going to get into phanomyces in this discussion because that could be a much longer discussion here when we start looking at all the research that's been done in there. But microspirilla blight is one of the major diseases that leaf diseases that we have had in the past, and there are some control measures for that. So let's have a quick look at that. Moving in, ideally the best timing is at that early flowering. So what you want to do when you're spraying for microspirilla blight, you want to inspect the crop at roughly about that 10% flowering stage, but no later than the 10th node. You want to do a scout. You want to see what the average disease symptoms are at least 10 different sites. And there's a risk chart that I'll put up in a moment here that we'll walk through to give you an idea whether or not it's the correct time to spray, or maybe you may want to wait a little bit to see how the next week or so progresses. Well, let's get it. And with this risk value assessment, when you total everything up, if you're at a risk value is less than 65, then the fungicide is not recommended. But once you hit that 65, that's when they typically recommend. That's when we typically recommend that a fungicide should be considered. So let's look at that chart. It can be found here at this link here below. So the first thing that we look at here is crop canopy. So if you're out scouting and you're looking at the crop canopy, so I'm out there looking, so let's just hit this one here. And here you're looking at 15, so I'm going to say normal. Not sure why it said lentil in this one. This was a P1 here, but we'll that must be just a little bit of a misinformation on that one. But in this case here, if you're, let's say, about that 8 plants per square foot normal, your score would be 15. Leaf wetness at noon, we're going to say we're high in this case, so we're going to put a 20 on there because we've had some pretty wet mornings. We look at the 5-day forecast, and they're calling for some light showers over the next 5 days. We're going to give that a score of 15. And symptoms on the pea plant, we're going to look at here. We're seeing about 20%. We're definitely seeing some symptoms. So when you total that up, that hits you 65. Now, if I was going out and the first 3 categories had the same scores, but I had trouble finding any visual symptoms, then that would drop it below 65. So then maybe I would want to wait a little bit. You will always get some microspirilla blight in peas, but when it sets into the crop is more of a consideration than if there's any there at all. If it sets in early, that's where you'll have the greatest yield loss. If it sets in late, so let's say after the plants are finished flowering and the seed set is already there, then it's not really going to affect the yield anymore. So this is why we kind of recommend this. It can kind of it might give you a little bit wider window. So if the first time you go out, rather than spraying it right then and there, you might say, well, the risk factor tells me that there's no real visual symptoms and conditions are fairly dry. I may want to wait a bit and then maybe delay that application so that I get a wider window of protection later on. Okay. With that, I'm going to close it off. That's what I had here for today, but I'd like to open it up for any questions. I'm curious if Lionel is back or online, or if it's just Lori and I.
No, Lionel is back. You just need to unmute yourself, Lionel, and if it's working for you, there you go.
Okay, can you hear me all good, Lori?
Yep, we can hear you.
Perfect. Sorry about the mix-up, but I guess that's when you deal with
We are having some audio challenges, Lionel. It's kind of cutting back and forth.
internet. You never know for sure if you're going to have it all the time or not. But we got
we're
going.
We're losing you, Lionel.
So a few questions for you here, Dennis.
Okay, let's see if we can get him.
In the Chrome variety tested for germination, will they be about once planted?
Oh, try that again, Lionel. I missed most of that. If you're breaking up.
Okay,
Lionel,
I actually have one question for you here, Dennis.
Okay, fire away.
Okay, in the Chrome variety, there seems to be a higher amount of abnormal peas when tested for germination. Will these be viable once planted?
Well, I guess when it comes to abnormal seed, I guess the one thing to kind of keep in mind and I've dealt with this in other crops before, an abnormal seed, or let's put it this way, a dead seed is better than an abnormal seed, because with a dead seed, you know what the germination is. You know that seed will not germinate. An abnormal seed, though, it will depend upon a lot of what growing conditions are like in spring, like what soil temperature is like. So abnormal will probably still produce a plant, but if it's put under stress, it may not come through as easily. So if you had a high percentage of abnormal seed, to be on the safe side, I would recommend bumping your seeding rate, just because peas are going into colder soil. Now, it just could be the year for that particular variety. We have seen that over the years, where you have on certain years, depending on how things matured at harvest time and what conditions were like, you have some weird things that happen with the germination for 1 year, and next year it's all fine again. So I would suggest increasing your seeding rate if you have a higher percentage of abnormals. Like if you're talking 4 or 5%, I'm not really concerned with it. If you're talking 10 or 15% abnormals, then I might have a bit more of a challenge with planting that without increasing your seeding rate.
Okay, great. I have a few more here. Dry year. Do we need to be worried about anything for spring planting?
With planting peas, you want to be planting peas. The range for planting is at 3/4 inch to kind of inch, or sorry, for peas, anywhere from, let's say, 1 inch to 3 inches is kind of the range for peas. I was thinking soybeans here for a minute. But really you still want to get it into moisture. So going into that 1 to 2 inch range, I think is fine. Just getting it into moisture, I think, is important. You can plant down to 3 inches. hopefully we won't need to plant that deep. I never like planting any kind of crop that deep, but just getting it into moisture is the biggest thing. The other challenge is, with some of the spring applied residual herbicides, they do need moisture to activate. So, we still need to get some rainfall to activate those products. So again, whatever spring conditions arise, I'm hoping that we're going to get some good rains after seeding or just before seeding, and that'll help things out.
Okay, great. So then how cold soil can we seed peas into?
With field peas, I'm just trying to remember typically if you're in that 2 to 5 degree range, I think to get peas into that soil, that type of temperature should be fine. 2 to 5, somewhere in there. Yeah.
Okay, so what do you recommend for inoculation, single or double?
What I recommend for inoculation will depend upon your history of peas on that field. If you have little to no history, then I would go on seed inoculant. So that could be liquid or peat, and a granular inoculant. If you're going with the seed treatment as well, and you have no history, I would definitely go the double inoculation. If you're going with, if you have a good history of peas in an area, and you're confident that, and you're not using a seed treatment, then the liquid on its own is probably good. But to me, I still lean towards the double inoculation, just because it is something that it's relatively inexpensive. And I think with the difference between pea inoculant and, let's say, soybean inoculant is the longevity of the inoculant as well. That's one thing I hadn't mentioned before, is that when you're inoculating peas, you want to inoculate them as close to seeding as possible when you're going on seed, where that granular, you're seeding it at the same time. So it gives you that wider window of protection. So.
Okay, great. So timing for spraying for pea and aphids and staging, what would that be?
Okay, so spraying for aphids or spraying for
aphids well, it says just spraying for pea, aphids, and staging.
There is a chart. I didn't cover that. That's typically kind of that in that early time, like early flowering time stage. Like once you have full seed set, then spraying for aphids really doesn't give you any benefit anymore. So it's that early flowering stage is where you want to be watching it, and early pod fill stage.
Okay, great. So will a seed treatment help me out with root rot? Had a big problem a few years back.
It'll help out with, as that one slide said, it'll help out with that root rot in early spring, like when, to kind of get the seed off to the races, Rhizoctonia, Fusarium, that soil-borne Fusarium. It won't per se help you out through the growing season.
And there was a comment on that too, that the field was on the wet side as well. So.
Yeah. So if you have fields, like during the growing season, you can have root rot move in throughout the season. And if you have a wet season, that seed treatment isn't going to help you in the later part of the season. What it does do is it gives you a good stand to work with, and I think that's going to be more beneficial than anything. And that comes down to making sure you have enough plants to start with. To me, that's one of the most important things, making sure you have a good plant stand. And that way, if you do lose a few plants for the growing season, you still have lots to work with yet.
Okay, and I've got the last question here. Says, any herbicide carryover issues?
That one I have to refer back to you. There are some issues like Launtrell, for example, and Curtail. Those are the first two that come to mind. There are some other ones which, right off the top of my head, I'd have to get back to you on that one. So if whoever asked that question wants to send me a direct email on that one, I will follow up with you on that one. But I know the Launtrell, Curtail, those are ones that really jump out to mind.
Okay, that's great. That's all the questions that we have. Those were some that were asked to Lionel. Those are some that were in the questions tab. So I appreciate that from everyone. So thank you very much, Dennis. I sure appreciate this. If you want to leave your slide up there, because I don't have any of Lionel's slides, we'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. You will have the information from past crop talks on the crop specialist contacts there. And if you haven't entered your CCA credits when you registered, you can certainly email me at lori.forbes@gov.ca. www.mb.ca. And thank you very much for everyone for your presentation today. And that will be all.
Lori,
Yep.
I just got a quick text message here. 2 products to be concerned with are Everest and fluticarbazone are 2 products to be concerned with for herbicide residue on peas.
Okay. That's great.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, and have a wonderful day.